We're here tonight for a conversation called Using Books to Engage Young Children in Talk About Race and Justice, Part 2. And the reason it's Part 2, we're really excited about this conversation. If some of you were involved in the first part in October, I believe it was, we had these folks on from Tandem, Partners in Early Learning, from the Bay Area, and they were just piloting a group that they started. They described it to me later as a book group with using picture books, which I think just sounds like, who doesn't want to be part of that? Like, everyone reads the book, you know, everyone can talk about it. And they started that with the some of the parents, a small group of parents and teachers in their community, teaching preschool, right? That preschool community. And they told us what they wanted to get out of it, and they're back at the end of it to talk a bit about what happened in their quest to use picture books to really talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. So it's exciting stuff to learn how they wrap that up and what lessons they bring forward and can share with us. So Andrew's going to introduce them. They're back.
Before I do that, we have my name is Andrew Grant Thomas. I'm one of the founders of Embrace Race, along with
Melissa Giroux, one of the founders of Embrace Race.
One of the founders of Embrace Race. I identify as Black or African American.
Black, white, multiracial, and we are also life partners.
We are also life partners.
With 2 kids upstairs.
Also want to let you know that, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat folder, a chat box, and a Q&A. By all means, participate in the chat. It gets going, it's lively and vibrant, lots of great information exchanged there. If you want to ask a question, though, and we do encourage you to submit your questions, please do that in the Q&A, because we won't be able to track and pull out the questions from the chat. Okay.
Right, and if you're on Facebook, you can ask questions there as well.
Let me start introducing our guests, whom we're really delighted to have again. Aija Simmons is a passionate educator mom. She currently serves as program manager in the Department of Social and Emotional Learning in the Oakland Unified School District. Drawing from her experience as an educator and instructional coach, Aija supports leaders in creating the optimal conditions for adult professional learning that can lead to transformational learning spaces for students. Central to Aija's work is an emphasis on equity, identity, critical literacy, and social emotional awareness. Come on in, Aija. Also introducing Sara Rizik-Baer. Sara believes in the power of children's books to foster critical thinking and the lifelong pursuit of knowledge. She currently serves as Director of Curriculum and Learning at Tandem, Partners in Early Learning, a Bay Area nonprofit dedicated to closing the opportunity gap for young children through the power of meaningful early learning experiences. Sara's holistic view of the urban education landscape is informed by multiple roles she's assumed in the field as a trainer, literacy coach, and bilingual teacher. Sara, welcome back. And Savitha Moorthy, who is a fierce advocate for equity, especially in early childhood education. Savitha is the executive director of Tandem, Partners in Early Learning, a job that offers her the opportunity and privilege to work with a diverse, talented team, including Sara, on the systemic challenges facing families with young children. Savitha's work is shaped by her training as a teacher and researcher, and by her experiences as an immigrant, woman of color, the member of a multiracial family, and the mother of a 4-year-old son. Is your son still 4?
I think he's 5.
I was going to say that since he's had a birthday since I wrote that introduction. So he's now, that should now say 5-year-old.
Yeah. Because he was 4 last time and it's been a minute.
Yeah.
But
even in a pandemic, time doesn't stay still.
Right.
So welcome back, everybody. Let's jump right in. Melissa did a little bit of a recap, but you heard that. I wonder if there is, if you could say a bit about the program, right? Why you started it, with whom, and what were you trying to learn when you started this program? Savitha. Can we start with you, Savitha?
First of all, thank you so much for having us here, both the last time around and this time around. It's a rare opportunity that we get to come and talk about a program when it's just getting started, and then we come back and talk about it when it's done, so we can talk about, you know, what we learned, what turned out the way we expected, what was different, and so on. So we started this program last fall. It was a pilot, and it was born out of a series of reflective conversations we were having at Tandem about how, as an organization that works with families of young children, using picture books as a vehicle to foster rich conversations among in family settings and classroom settings, we started engaging internally in conversations about how we could participate in and contribute to the conversation about addressing systemic racism, and how we could do that in a way that was well aligned with our mission, how we could use the tools and resources that we had in our organization, how we could build up, use that as a starting point, how we could build on it, and how we could really bring together a small community of the parents that we serve to create resources for other parents and for other educators. And so at Tandem, one of the things that's very much at the center of the work that we do is our book collection. We have up to 1,600 books in our inventory right now. The books are in 21 different languages, and our mission is to use these books as the center around which families and families can have conversations about a variety of different topics. But books are tools, and they only go so far. And in order for the tools to be effective, people need to be using them. And so we wanted to center on the books, but really bring together a community of people who could think together using books as resources and create strategies, brainstorm ideas for how parents of young children could use books as starting points to engage their families in conversations, critical conversations about race, racial equity, racial justice in an age appropriate way for young children. So that's kind of how it came about.
Let me ask just one follow-up, and Aija or Sara, feel free to jump in on this one. I'm just wondering, so of course we are clearly kindred spirits in this work. And one thing we know from our 5 years is that a lot of people ask for the books, right? And indeed in registration, we got a lot of questions about book recommendations. Parents and even educators, clearly there are some, but tend to be less frequently asked about how to read the book, right? And I wonder to what degree did you recognize, right, that was also, I mean, as you say, it's not only about the book, but is it that you recognized that, you saw that perhaps your folks had used some support with that, or was there actually sort of this grassroots pressure? Were there people raising their hand and saying, I have the books, but I'm struggling? Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, one of the things that we heard a lot last summer was there were a lot of book lists that were becoming available. There was a lot of conversations happening about how people could diversify their bookshelves at home, how people could decolonize their picture bookshelves at home, and how to put together a collection of books that would be both mirrors that reflect their children and their families, as well as windows that gave them opportunities to learn about other children, other families in their community. This is a typology from Rudy and Sims Bishop that's very much at the center of the work that we do. And a lot of people were also telling us that, okay, I have the books, but now what? How do I have a conversation at home with my child or with my children? What do I do when I'm not sure about where the conversation is going? How do I handle the questions that come up? So there was we were hearing from a lot of people in our personal networks and in our community about, just this over and over, this idea of I have the books and now what? So that our program was also in response to that.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And how, can you tell us a bit about how it worked sort of logistically? I'm thinking book club, for picture books, but maybe a little bit more about how often you met, who was there, the composition of the group.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that, and I think we would definitely change some things after, but I'll talk about how we did it. We recruited we're looking to recruit about 10 parents. We ended up getting about 8 parents. That were this was the first cohort, so I definitely went to my community and folks that I definitely were familiar with for the most part. So the first cohort was a group of parents who were also educators as well. And we really wanted to make sure that it was a group that we didn't want to make it too broad right away, knowing that there might be space for that in the future. So we tried to make sure that the families that were in our group were identified as Black, Latinx, or mixed heritage. And I myself am mixed, and Savitha was both a participant as well as a co-designer, and she of a mixed race family as well. So that was part of it. It ended up actually happening was, I think all of our families except for 2 identified as mixed race families, but all had those identities of Black, Latinx, or mixed, and actually AAPI. So those were the group that we started with, and we met every month for about 4 months, for about a 2-hour long Zoom session that we would meet to do this. And the sessions, we started off as just really strong community building. We wanted, and actually Aija helped me co-facilitate that first session, and we were really trying to build community with each other so people could get to know one another, so we could have brave conversations. And as part of that community building, which Aija really helped me think through, was really getting people to name their anxieties around talking about this kind of subject matter. A lot of folks come in understanding that we want to talk to our kids about these complicated subjects, but there's anxieties in there. And so we really wanted people to talk about what those were, what those fears were, and then understanding where people were coming from as they entered into this conversation and why we were in this space together. And then from there on, we built the sessions so that we started with community building, and then we talked a lot about book selection, and we tried to understand what are parents thinking about as they're going about selecting a high quality book that represents diversity. Then we talked about their book recommendations. So they actually went back and read the books that we sent to them. We sent them a big box. I sent them about 10 books each. And so they were invited to either use the books we sent them or their own, and they came up with their own book recommendations. And then the last session, we really got into those conversation strategies and try to figure out from these conversations, could we pull out any commonalities among the parents and how they actually talk about these subjects with their kids. So that was logistically how it worked. And the last thing I want to talk about too was the book titles. So we had about 52 book titles that we selected. And from those book titles, I created packages for every parent in the group that I tried to represent. I was trying to do some books that I believed were going to be mirror books for their family, and some that were more kind of windows and doors books. So I tried to create a healthy mix based on their self-reported identities. But I think I would do that probably a little bit differently if I were to do this again. So, but yeah, that's logistically how it worked. I hope that made sense.
Aija, I want to come to you, and I'm thinking about, so you and Savitha are both parents to young children, but whereas Savitha is the ED of Tandem, you were first and foremost wearing a parent hat. And at the same time, your professional experience is super relevant, right, to this. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about maybe what your big expectations were, and whether or not, whether what happened met those expectations, diverged from those expectations. And one thing I want to lift up, I remember last time you talked about, maybe a thing that might not be obvious to folks. You talked about the community that you found with other parents, right? Not only in, seeking support for talking to their children, using books to talk with their young kids, but just talking about your own experience, right? As people of color moving through the world, and how that might come to bear on how you engage books, how you engage your children around these issues. So just what's the highlights for you?
So many highlights, but as you just said, I think one of the biggest highlights was the community of parents. I've been an educator for many years now, but reading books from the frame of raising a child is a whole different ballgame. Like, I've read books in my classroom, I've read them for curriculum reasons or for interest, but when you're reading the books in the context of trying to raise a liberated, race conscious, proud African-American child in this context, that's a whole different reason to be, reading books. And it was something that I didn't think I could just do by myself. So when this opportunity came up, I was like, yeah, I need some help. There are things that are coming up that I don't always know how to deal with. I don't always know what the response should be. And I would like to be able to be in community with other people. And then what happened as we started reading books, and all of us had our different selection of books, and people were sharing. In one session, we were sharing the books that resonated with us as mirrors. And what I noticed was happening was like, so for me, the book that I chose to share is called Saturday by Oge Mora. And I was talking about, as an insider in this community, what are the parts of this book that really resonated with me? And so as each person from different backgrounds shared what in their mirror book was resonating with them, it helped me think as a mom, oh, this is a great thing to know. Because when I read this book as an outsider, I may not know what the really powerful parts of this book is for the members of this community. But hearing other people say, oh, it's this part of this book where they go through the community and you see all of these different communal landmarks. Or did you know the story of Papel Picado in this book? Why this is so powerful on this page, or these wishes at the end of this book. It helped me to read with my daughter. Yeah, it helped me read with my daughter in a more in-depth way, hearing from the perspective of insiders within that community and what was important. So that was super powerful. Then as things came up, we had some issues around here and around our house where we had some police in our yard and other things. And I was like, oh, I need a book for this because we have to go deeper. And I was able to immediately reach out to that community and say, who's read something like this, or who has a book that you think fits this scenario, because I need to be able to engage with my daughter without having to tell the whole story. So that was really one of those benefits that you get after the fact, along with all of the things that I learned about what it takes to read beyond just enjoyment, and to read for some life lessons, and to read for some practice and things like that. I have other highlights, but I'm gonna stop talking right now.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, do you get a recommendation to help you and your daughter navigate that police situation?
So we had a couple of recommendations, and you know what? Every time somebody asks me on the spot, I'm like, what is the name of that book? But we got, we had Something Happens in Our Town recommended to us. Then we had another book. I think the little boy's name, Hands Up. Yep. And then the third one, I think the boy's name is Milo. And he goes on a train ride, and they go to Milo Sees the World or something like that. Thank you. It's in the chat. Milo Imagines the World. So we use those three to have a couple of conversations around policing.
I wonder, I mean, I love what you said. I mean, all of what you said, but when you said you felt like you didn't have the right answer, and that was, that's part of why we started Embrace Race as well, right? Is just that exact feeling of like, oh, I feel like I could advise someone else, but when it comes to doing it in this different relationship, it's really hard and I don't have the right answer. And I just wonder whether you feel, or whether in general people started to feel, did they start to get the right answer, or did they start to feel more comfortable not having the right answer?
We talked a lot about our fears. And so like, even as we were looking at these books and thinking about talking about race, innocence came up a lot. And like, when we have these conversations, what is happening with the innocence and bright-eyed wonder of our children? And so we kept grappling. And I think that's just the truth of it. As things happen and things unfold, you don't come to the answer, but the grappling makes you more comfortable. And so one of the strategies that I took and ran all the way down the street with was, instead of looking for the answer, let me work with my daughter around asking the questions. So now, I'm very hesitant when we read a book or we're reading a book about a community that's not ours to pretend with her like I know the answers. So we practice now. What is the question we would ask? What is the question we would ask this character? What is the question we would ask someone in this community? How would we find out more about that? Rather than trying to tell her, I know all the things about this community and I can answer the million questions that we have about what's happening in this book. We practice. So how would we ask someone in this community the question so that we can get the answer?
I love that.
Especially when, right, so many of the stories we know and we tell about communities that we don't belong to are really pat stories, right? Received stories. So just shaking it up by saying maybe we don't know, because actually I don't even know how I think I know that, is a huge lesson for all of us.
Yeah.
Savitha and Sara, want to come to you and ask both about sort of big highlights for you and also any surprises. Sara, you already mentioned some things you might do differently the next time around. Do you want to speak to any of that? Savitha, how about we start with you?
As Aija says, there were a lot of highlights. I think the idea of gathering together in community with a group of parents grappling with the same kinds of issues was a powerful experience. And I think it also, what made it particularly powerful for me was that it normalized the idea of using picture books to talk to children about race and racial justice. We just took that as a given, so within that space, we were able to have a lot of nuanced conversations. It also normalized the anxiety and the nervousness that we all felt as parents and as people in this world. And, I think to Arja's point, what was helpful to me and what has been helpful to me, continues to be helpful to me, is to really conceptualize the space, the book sharing experience, as a space where adults and children can learn together. In that, that kind of removes the idea, and to position it as a space where adults and children can learn together, and also be explicit with children about this idea that this is a space where we're learning together. I know some things because I've lived on this earth more years than you have, but there's a lot that I don't know. So we're learning together, we're exploring together, and just going in with the idea that the conversations, and I think I said this the last time, they're going to be imperfect and they're going to be incomplete. But the beautiful thing about a book sharing experience and a conversation with your child is that it's not one and done. You get to have it like over and over and over again. And I think those are a couple of things that I probably would be more explicit about the next time we did this, would be to say that this is a space where we're learning together. I think there are some comments or some questions in the chat about what kind of advice do we have for parents in general? What kind of advice do we have for white parents in particular? I think positioning this very explicitly as a space where grown-ups and children are learning together, which means that mistakes are normal, that the conversations are going to be incomplete and imperfect, and that you may say something that you may want to revise based on new things we learn. I think normalizing that is also important. And I think it's important to model that to children that, I thought this, but I've learned some new things. And as a result of that, I'm thinking about this in a slightly different way. I think that's a really important thing to model for children. So that's one thing that I think I would be more explicit about, that this is not a space where one person is the expert and one person is the novice. Sara, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Savitha, and I think that was, I'll say that when we went into this project, and I'll talk about myself personally, I definitely thought we'd come out with this list of this is strategies of how you're going to talk to kids about these books, and Savitha and we've been trying to think about how to frame that. What we've really come to is that the reason I think it's so hard is because there's really no prescriptive way to do this. And even though I still want that so bad, but that's the thing is that I think what we found was that it was just really having conversations with people and becoming aware of the opportunities to have these careful conversations with children, I felt like was one of the biggest lessons we got out of it. I know, for example, one of the parents, you know, she shared with me, she said, Sarah, to be honest, I looked at books, I never thought twice about, you know, identity and all these things that you're noticing. And now I'm noticing them everywhere. And I said, wow, you know, even if you don't yet know how to talk about it completely, I think it's just, we built some kind of awareness of the fact that there are these opportunities. And I think that was really important. The other big thing that I think really came to the conclusion of was that you just cannot have these conversations in one reading, right? Or one session with your child. Like, each of these books was so rich and packed with so many things that we wanted, you know, these books to not just be an experience in which parents and children were talking about these really deep subjects, but also an experience of joy, right? So we didn't want to leave that out of it. And that came up a lot too, that joy, having these books and having a joyful experience is really, really important. And so you want to read the book in a way that's joyful. And then also there's other times in which you can have a deeper conversation because you've now read the book a few times. And the last thing too, I think I really felt came up to the forefront was these books kind of serve as a foundation for further conversations, right? It's like a reference point. So now I have a book where I can talk about the papel picado. I can talk about, you know, the issues that we're seeing in the book. Like, we see farm workers in a book, and now when we see them out when we're driving somewhere and we see a farm worker, we can talk about that and have that conversation. And now the child has something to reference to. And so I think that was a really big thing that we observed through these conversations. So
yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm wondering how it's changed your practice, maybe, to be involved in this group. You know, like how you're reading, maybe more about how you're reading differently to your daughter, Aija.
Yeah, so again, we started focusing a lot on what are the questions. And I have been helping her actually rehearse the questions. So it turns more into like a role play, because I understand that she's going to be out in the world and she may see things that she doesn't understand, or things that she wants to know more about, or, you know, people doing something that so we practice. What would that question sound like? What would you say? How might you say it? And then sometimes I give her some language to use in particular situations. And that's something that I actually have started doing with students in classrooms when I go in, because I get to do a lot of SEL lessons with students in my district. And so we have now begun saying even something as simple as, I think I'm reading someone's body language. But if I'm honest, different cultures show up in different ways. Different people show up in different ways. So before I even assume that you're feeling sad or you're feeling joyful or whatever, what could I ask? Could I ask you, how are you feeling? Or could I say, seems like you're not feeling okay today, as opposed to walking in with an assumption that I'm reading someone's emotions right. So that's been a really powerful shift for me. It's like, we don't have to have all the answers. It's okay to ask someone an honest, open-ended question and be positioned and ready to receive the learning that we get. The other piece, and this is from me as a Black woman, with all of the experiences that we have as Black people and all of the ways that our Black emotions are read in many different contexts. It's been beautiful to look at books that have illustrations that have a range of emotions for a Black person, where in one book, you get to see a Black person in joy or in sadness or in brokenheartedness or in anger. And there are so many children's books now that have a variety of emotions with a Black character. And I think that is so powerful for other people to see. It's like, let's not just see what Black people look like when they're doing one particular thing, or when they're angry about something, or when they're protesting. But how do we expose our children to the range of emotions that Black people have, and normalize every emotion in a Black person? Like, you know, it seems really crazy to have to say this, but it's true. In our experiences out in the world, when we show up in spaces with different emotions, And I'm saying this from personal experience, people don't always know what to do. So it's important that people see us in a range of different emotions and, you know, understand that we have the gambit of emotional experience, and that there may be some internal work that needs to be done so people can handle us being everything that we are. And so for my daughter, that's really important. I want her to see people of color angry. I want her to see them doing yoga. I want her to see them taking breaths. I want her to see them feeling powerful and, you know, sharing something in confidence and standing in all of their full authority, and be able to see herself in all of those different spaces as brilliant, beautiful, humble, you know, everything that we need to validate. Including, there was one book that my daughter fell in love with called Another, and it's a picture book, but the little girl goes in and out of portals, and my daughter is so into portals. But even having your imaginations validated by having a person of color that looks like you doing some of the same kind of imagining that you're doing when we're in the bathroom pretending like we're on our way into another world is so powerful, and something that I didn't have. I can't remember. Like, I remember reading books like Amelia Bedelia and all of those other things. I don't ever remember reading a picture book about a Black girl who was imagining herself as a scientist or this and that in my elementary school experience. I only got to experience that as an adult. So I think that's another powerful piece for people who are doing race work, especially around Blackness, is to show our children Black people in a range of emotions.
You know, Aija, to say, I mean, I love that. And that.
Can I add one thing to what Aija's saying? Aija, what you said about how your daughter needs to see Black people experiencing the gamut of emotions, I think my son needs to see that too. And so that's the advice. I think there are some questions in the chat about, you know, how do we engage with this topic as white parents? I feel like really like one place to start is by auditing your bookshelf and make sure that your children also have that same opportunity to see children like Aija's daughter and my son experiencing that range of emotions. I think that's where we start building compassion and empathy and understanding. And that's the foundation for racial justice.
And I think it's about certainly how Black people are seen and portrayed in the range, the emotional range. And it's about the conversation about race in general, right? So we are launching, you know, a storytelling initiative that we'll be talking about fairly soon. But, you know, as we try to recruit people to share stories, it'll be really important that it not just be about, right, discrimination and bigotry and inequality and inequity. Those things are important, and we definitely want to talk about those things. And it's about joy and comfort and family and love and right, like the full range. If we tend to deal with the race in this country with along a very truncated, right, emotional part of a very truncated part of the spectrum. If we can show that it's, you know, yes, it runs the full gamut, right, engagement with race, I think more people will be willing to talk about it.
It's not asking too much.
It's definitely not asking too much.
Yeah. So, so Savitha and Sara, do you want to share more about sort of what you'll take forward from the experience? We're getting in lots of questions, but wondering just how this will change Tandem, or how this will there be more cohorts? You know, how is it already changing how you interact with parents who weren't part of the program, for example?
And I wonder if I can add just piggyback on that. I'm wondering, right, so this first time you built it together, right? This is clearly a strong co-creation. I wonder to what extent you would do that again, or to what degree you would do the same thing. Is it something that needs to be co-created with every new group? Or to what extent are you building on what you've built here already?
I can try to answer, and then Savitha, please jump on in. I think the intention is always to definitely do this again, right? This was a pilot, and so we wanted to see how it goes, see what we learned, and then definitely do it again. And I think what the important thing is, whether it's Savitha and I working on it together exactly, I think one of the big things we learned is it's important that you're working with the with the parents in your group, right? One of our best sessions was the one that I was able to co-facilitate and plan with Aija, and it was so powerful. And it was mentioned by other parents when they debriefed it with us, because it was someone from the group and was kind of it was co-owning that space a little bit more. So I think we'd be more intentional about that throughout all of the sessions would be definitely one thing. And I think that it's interesting how we would do it, because a bit, so much of this was about the process. And even though I very much wanted to have like a lesson plan, scope and sequence very carefully laid out, it really was better to not have it that way. So every session, we would go back, discuss what had happened, see what the conversations were. I would actually, we recorded all of the sessions, so I was able to go back and look at transcripts to actually find what were the gems and the things that people said that we wanted to build on in the next session. And so I think you have to have some of that, definitely. So you can't exactly make this is exactly the curriculum for it, although I do think there is a structure. I think if we were to do this again too, I think we would ensure that everyone had at least some of the same titles, maybe at least 4 of the books in everyone's package were the same, because I think what would have been really cool is if we had more of here's one book, let's all look at it together and let's all discuss the opportunities we would have and how we would have a conversation about this particular book. Whereas what happened in the group was some people had similar books, everyone had different books, so we had different conversations. So I think that would have been something I would have definitely, I think if we were to do it again, we would do. And probably also add a little bit more in around just building some more knowledge within the group around identity development in regards to child development. So just to kind of lay that framework and grounding just a little bit more. But yes, the intention is absolutely to do this again. And I think the intention is also to try not just do this with parents, but also a group of educators or nonprofit leaders that work with families and children. And so I think there's a lot of avenues that this can go. But I don't know if Savitha has more to add to that.
I want to actually lift up something that Laurel Felt is saying in the comments about how the absence of a structure or the absence of a predetermined scope and sequence was in and of itself a challenge to white supremacy culture. And I don't know that we would have gone in with that clear articulation, Laurel, like you're offering us, but we did go in. It's a tandem value. You can see our full list of values on our website. It's a tandem value to really recognize and acknowledge and value the expertise of the families and the communities that we work with. And we engage in all of our projects in the spirit of partnership. And so this idea of co-creation, we're right now in the middle of tinkering with our mission statement, and the word co-create is a very strong contender for what's going to be in the next iteration of the mission statement. And so this idea of co-creation is very hardwired into our thinking. And so while we have certain resources, like we have this this exhaustive book collection that we can bring to the table as a resource for people to engage with, I think we also don't assume that we know the answers, and that the answers or the process or the ideas of this is less about the products and it's more about creating things together with a community of people. And so this element of co-creation, while it might evolve, I doubt is going to go away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's what I was gonna ask about, is just you could have, and people I see in the chat and elsewhere, people asking about a curriculum, right? And there's so much to be gained by co-creating. I wonder, Aija and Sara, if you have more to say about that, about what you would, about the advantage of not going for a curriculum on the shelf or a book list that you see online. I mean, go to your librarian, talk about your kids, go to your teacher, talk about your kids. What are their interests? What are their identities, but also what are their interests? And we can get more specific to the kids we're raising and the families we're raising and the context we're raising in. Yeah, if you all have more to add to that.
I'm trying to think about how to answer that. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a balance as always. And I think, I definitely think that, yes, some kind of guiding principles or structures would be helpful so that people can go off and take, we've done this. And so great, we've learned some things and we hope that people can learn from our lessons. But with that being said, that was made in this very, it was a very small community that was very relevant to the folks in our specific community. And so that's why I agree with Savitha in the sense of really, going and trying to really think about who you're working with and exactly who those people are so that you're giving other folks the power to really form what those conversations can look like. And no, it is not easy, but I very much agree with Savitha in that sense. At the same time, I do recognize some people do need some guidance.
I think for me, more so than the desire for a curriculum, because this work was really about me being a mommy to a 5-year-old who sometimes wants to listen and sometimes doesn't, who says some of the craziest things I have ever heard. I cannot understand where that thought came from. So I don't know that there's a curriculum for that or that anybody has the time to write that curriculum. So I think more than I wanted a curriculum, I wanted a space because I am trying to raise a conscious child who has experiences in diverse communities. I feel like I grew up really confident and strong. But when I look back on my experience, a lot of my childhood was really around Black people. I was around Black people. And that is, I didn't have a diverse, I didn't go to schools that were super diverse, and my family community wasn't super diverse, but my child is not having that experience. She is the darkest person in her classroom. And so that requires a different skill set. So I think I just wanted a place and a space to say, here's what I'm grappling with. Here's what just came up. How do I talk to my kid about this? And so I think that was the benefit for me. I don't want to read the curriculum lesson plan at home when I'm just trying to be a mommy and respond. But I do want to have a space where I can talk about the ideas so that when I come back to, the conversation with my daughter, I've had a little bit more opportunity to think some things through, heard from a few different parents of kids at different ages, heard what they're doing, looked at the book for myself before we read it together so that I have an idea of what I'm looking at. But for me personally, the space was way more valuable to me than I think a lesson plan would have been, or a book discussion guide would have been.
This next question, I want to put a number of them together, and the question then looks like this. Are there any picture books that you would not read to your child? Right. So, and in particular, there's of course always this ongoing debate about controversial books, right? So it's, some of the Tintin books, it's Babar the Elephant, it's whatever it is. We have a question specifically about Babar the Elephant, but this mom read the book, with some reservation to her child, and then explained what difficulty she had with it, right? Why she had some difficulty with it, and is wondering if that's okay. And I wonder how do you approach that? Of course, you have, as you know, folks who say you can read anything to any book to a child. You just need to engage properly, whatever that might look like exactly. And you have some people who say, look, there are lots of good books out there, especially if you're not sure that you can, or you're not confident that you can deal with it well, not perfectly, but well. Why don't you put those books, right, that book aside until you feel a bit more confident or the child is a bit older? Sarah.
I want to answer this because this came up in our group. And one of the strategies that we identified, this came up from one of the parents, was they say, I don't let my child watch this show or read this particular book. And one of the strategies we came up with was, we'll talk about the why not. So children are going to come to you, right, with a book that they want to read or a show that they want to watch. And it's up to every individual parent to make a decision about whether they feel like their child should be exposed to whatever they don't like in that book or show. But the really important thing is explaining to your child, well, why don't we read this book? Or why don't we watch this show? What's missing? Who's missing? or how is this character being represented, and why? And I think that was really, really important, because so many times kids are told, I know I was told when I was a child, you can't play with Barbies, you can't, watch a certain show. And I didn't know why. And of course that made me want to do it more. And so I think it's really important that when we have a feeling like that, we explain to our kid and have that important conversation, because that in itself is a meaningful way to build critical literacy. But I'd be really interested to hear what Aija and Savitha have to say too about that.
Thank you, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Aija or Savitha?
I think this is a complicated question just because my daughter is 5, but she's been super emotional all of her life. So some things I don't want to read to her in particular moments. So like I'm like, oh, this book is gonna send us into limbo for 15 pages. She's not gonna know what happened to the character, and that's gonna be a hard emotional journey for us to take. Tonight might not be the night for that. So I have to think about things like that for her, because she goes all in with a character. And if somebody's sick, if someone disappears from the story for a while or goes away and we don't know that they're coming back, she is all in emotionally, like on the edge of her seat. So for that reason, sometimes I'm particular about maybe not this book right now, just because of who she is. And then some books I'm waiting to like bring in when things come up. So there are topics that we haven't fully breached yet. We haven't gotten into gender identity yet, just because I'm like, I don't know if that's where we're talking about race. She hasn't said anything about gender. I don't know if gender has come up at our school in terms of gender identity. We do talk about gender roles. So like if we read a book that is about the penguins or whatever, she probably misses a lot of the stuff that I know is happening in the book. And she may be hearing the language, but she's not really thinking, oh, the gender identity of this child is blank. So it hasn't come up yet. So I'm waiting for moments when she says something or I hear her notice something to already be ready with a book that we can unpack together for that particular moment when that's where her mind is. So for me, I don't think it's about like, are there things I won't read to her? It's more about when will I read them to her? And when does she need me to read them to her? Mm-hmm. And that's just where I'm at today, because she's just 5. In 6 years, yeah. I'm like, that was the wrong approach. I don't know.
So we have several questions that are about anti-Blackness and about particularly when is it too early to begin talking to kids about anti-Blackness or preparing them for encounters with police officers. Like all parents, says this parent, I want to preserve their imagination and innocence, yet as a Black father, I do not want to risk their lives and not preparing them for pitfalls they may encounter. There are other questions about good books for children's books on Black hair to promote Black children feeling good about their hair. So anti-Blackness is just like, woo, running is such a strong current that we need to address. And I wonder if this has come up in the group, just of, Aija, you said that this is something that you're specifically with your daughter who feels like and is the darkest girl in the room, that you're thinking about, and I guess using books to talk about. I imagine if there are recommendations or stories you have about how that's come up in your group.
I want to also have Sara speak to this a little bit, because Sara was clear when she brought me onto this project that she was not shying away from anti-Blackness, and that that was something that Tandem was specifically doing work around, and she wanted to make sure that the families who engage in these conversations were willing to go there, and they put that out there, I believe, as early as our first session. So it felt really safe for me to kind of dip into and share and talk about some of my experiences as a Black mom of a dark-skinned Black child. So I think that I hope Sara shares some of why that Tandem, and Savitha share why Tandem took that stance. But we talked a lot about the insider parts of particular books and things that I'm looking for when I look at particular books. One for me was the range of emotions. because I don't want her to only see Black people in particular emotional phases where we either have to be all the way in our joy or all the way in our anger. I needed her to see everything in between, particularly because she's often feeling people's pain. So we have to do a lot of breathing and processing, and she's super empathetic. So I needed books where, you know, we saw all of those kinds of things. And so we look for things that we know that match what we experience and what we have. And so if the book has a character in a hair salon, and I'm like, okay, yeah, look at that puff style, look at these braids, and it helps her to be able to see herself in particular ways with particular styles that we can do, our ways that we, you know, show up in different spaces and things that are really meaningful to us. I think that was a powerful part of looking at the mirror parts of books, but then also being able to see commonalities in other cultures, because I wear a lot of head wraps, right? So we read this other book, and the name of the book is escaping me right now. We read this other book where there was a woman with the hijab in the story. And so my daughter noticed her wrap, and we were able to talk about the differences and why we wear our wraps. Even though, you know, both of us are covering our head, we talked about why mommy's is for a certain reason, and the person in this book is wearing theirs for an entirely different reason. And we talked about and unpacked that. In that same story, there's a scene where the character is praying. So we talked about the different ways that people pray, because we pray as well. So that was another thing that came up, is like, how can we be strong in our culture and in our Blackness and see our Blackness as beautiful, and then look at the variety of different ways other cultures show up. So we had one book conversation where we talked about all of the different food scenes in books, because children's books have a lot of table scenes where people are eating and they show, you know, food in different cultures. And we talked about how we could find the common scenes in different books from different cultures and have conversations with our children about, okay, what does this scene look like? What does that scene look like? What are some commonalities and differences from our culture to another culture?
Mm-hmm.
Sara, did you want to weigh in?
Well, I think, you know, I think number one is that children are developing identity, and I mean, we can call it like pre-prejudice as early as 2 years old, if not earlier, right? So we have to have these conversations because whether or not we're comfortable with it, they are noticing things in their environment, and to what extreme and how that goes is very different for every child, of course. But the fact is that kids are noticing differences. And I've had, you know, teachers and school directors call me and say, we're having some major issues in our playground. We're having these 2 and 3-year-olds saying really terrible things about their Black classmates. What do I do, right? So I know for a fact that we got to start talking about it early. And Savitha and I think, you know, in our organization as Tandem, we agree we can't have any conversations around social justice without talking about race and without talking about anti-Blackness, especially in this society, right? And so we do take that as I think it's important that we make a stand about that. And so that was really important to us. And I think in terms of the way the conversations went and you know, with the families, I still think we never landed on exactly like how exactly do you go about specifically talking about that, other than not shying away from these conversations and really having those mirrors and windows conversations that Aija is talking about. And so what we mean by that, and she gave a really good example, but to build on that is, you know, how do you get children to see themselves reflected, where they don't see themselves reflected? How are you able to say, hey, here's this identity, here's what's happening. Let's talk about it, let's discuss it. And then how do we connect that back to your own life so you don't see that as weird or different, right? It's just something distinct, but it's not, you know, anything that we need to make a big deal out of. And so that's what we really want to encourage. But I do think that we have to start talking about it early and often.
And, you know, clearly you mentioned, Sara, I think it was you mentioned that you hope next or soon to engage educators, right? Certainly not only parents. And I'm wondering, we have a number of questions from parents wondering about engaging early childhood educators on one hand, and we have a number of educators, some of them early childhood educators, wondering what's the takeaway essentially for me And I wonder if you could offer something about that. You know, Aja, you mentioned early that, of course, you're an educator. You know, support people around SEL. You're also a parent, and it's a different role. And you needed, right? Because you can support educators on one hand doesn't mean that you didn't feel the need for support from your parent perspective, dealing with your own child. So what does it all mean? Savitha, can I come to you with that?
Um, I think in the same way that we engage parents, we would engage educators. We would start by forming a community of like-minded people who are interested. As Sarah says, you know, it's so important to have these conversations early and often, and model this as a space for learning together, and normalizing these conversations, I think, is important. Um, and so we would engage educators in the same way, like come bring a community of like-minded people together, then and start with the book and discuss the kinds of conversations that are possible around the books. And if there are educators in the audience that are interested in exploring this topic further, I would welcome them to get in touch with us.
Is there any way, and we had a few questions about engaging young children in social justice topics.
There's a question in the Q&A that I particularly wanted to respond to, where I think this is similar to some of the questions that have come up about what is the best stage to engage with books, and how conversations about race and racism are maybe a tough starting place for a young child, for a 2 or a 3-year-old child. And I think the way we have been talking about it in our community is to not to have the first book or the first book sharing experience be about racism or be about some of the challenges of racism. It is exactly what Aja was talking about. It's making sure that you're reading or sharing books with your young child. It's a diverse collection of books that shows a lot of different characters, that shows Black characters and Indian characters and people from a variety of different backgrounds. And I think then also making it part of your normal practice to do things like talk about skin color and compare like your skin tones with the skin tones of the characters you see in the book. I feel like there are a lot of important and gentle introductions to heavier topics, but in these early years, so much is about developing children's vocabulary and their foundation for engaging in conversations about difficult topics at a later point when they're ready to. So I feel like we tend, when we think about having an anti-racist bookshelf, we tend to think only about books that address heavy topics like topics of racism. And I think those books are important and they have a place on our bookshelf and a place in the conversations that we have as a family, but they might not be the most developmentally appropriate starting point, either as books or as conversation topics for young children. The one other thing that I've started doing as a parent, we always talk about taking our real life experiences and bringing them into book sharing conversations. I think it's just as important to take these conversations you have about books and bring them into real life. My son and I rode a bus last week, and it was an opportunity for us to talk about Last Stop on Market Street. So I think those kind of like that kind of two-way transfer between books and real life is really important.
Right, because when you're reading books, you're reading the world, and can do it the other way too. Yeah. Thank you so much. We could go talk on and on because there is so much you learned, and you're so thoughtful and
forthcoming.
Yeah, you really you're really honest, authentic. So we really appreciate that. That's why you're going to be on again, you guys. You can't get rid of us. But we want to say thank you to our wonderful guests, and thank you to everyone for participating. We will send you the recording tomorrow, and we'll have a transcript and resources up within the week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.